I'm Leah Lane, an award-winning travel writer and author of Places I Remember, Tales, Truths, Delights from 100 Countries. On this podcast, we share conversations with travelers about fascinating destinations and memorable experiences around the world. Are you intrigued by the idea of lost cities? Are you curious about ancient people, wondering about who they were, where they came from, and the struggles and successes they encountered along the way? Archaeologists study people through time from 3 million years ago to yesterday by excavating, recovering, and analyzing material culture, another word for artifacts and features, anything that was made or used by humans. Through archaeology, we can understand where and when people lived on the earth, but also why and how they lived. Some people consider archaeology a form of time travel, a way to peer into the past to gain a richer understanding of our world today and our place in it. You can enroll in a university course or read about it, but there's nothing like visiting and even volunteering at an archaeological site. Later in the podcast, we'll share about how travelers can even participate in an archaeological dig, and there are links in the episode's show notes. Our guest, Anne Williams, writes about these marvelous things and has worked on sites throughout the world. She's the author of Lost Cities, Ancient Tombs, 100 Discoveries That Changed the World, published by National Geographic. Welcome, Anne, to Places I Remember.
Hi, it's great to be here. Let's talk about archaeology.
Okay. Now, you did field work on archaeological sites. Tell us a bit about your experience. What's it like to travel and work at an archaeological dig?
I have been very lucky because unlike a lot of academic archaeologists who specialize in a certain time period and a certain place, because I have looked at archaeology through the prism of journalism, I've gotten to cover all sorts of things. I have been inside the Pyramid of the Moon at Teotihuacan.
Where is Teotihuacan?
It's right outside Mexico City. Digs in Bulgaria, a dig in Alaska. I've covered a dig in Central America. I've done a lot of work in Egypt. I've been very lucky in that I sort of parachute in when it looks like they're going to come across something very cool, as opposed to having to slog it out year after year at the same site that a lot of professional archaeologists do.
So you get to go in and out. Do you get paid for this? Do you get room and board? How does it work if a traveler wants to do that?
I was working for National Geographic magazine, and so we would set it up with the dig. Most of the time, if people are volunteering, it sort of depends on where you're doing this. A lot of digs in Israel, for instance, their business model is to charge volunteers money. They have a lot of slots for volunteers. That's the good news. You pay money, then you get room and board, and you work.
How long do you stay there, for example?
It depends on how the dig director has set things up. I think Eric Klein, who works at Tel Kabri, you can sign up for a week, or you could sign up for the whole season. That's right. How he works. But different dig directors do different things. Jody Magnus, who works at Hukok, she brings a whole bunch of students from a consortium of universities who work with her, and they stay the whole season. They are at the site of Hukok right now. Every year they work the whole month of June. Rick Knecht, who is working at the dig that I worked on in Alaska. He's starting to work on that model as well. As far as Rick is concerned, if you want to volunteer and you want to pay to go up there, he's happy to have you.
Great. I have been told by people who have done this that it sounds fantastic, and it is fantastic, but there's heat and cold and rain and snow and dirt and lots of mud and bugs and snakes and all of that kind of thing. So you're really working. You put hard hats on very often. You might be extremely, uncomfortable for a while. It's rigorous, but you're studying the cultures and lifeways of prehistoric and historic people, what they have done, why they do it. It's fascinating. So we're going to have more information a little later, as I said in the podcast. What have you learned most from visiting or working at archaeological sites?
Well, I think the study of archaeology in general is interesting because what it teaches us is how smart and inventive and resilient human beings are. There have been ups and downs and backs and forths all through human history. And somehow, not only have human beings survived, they have thrived. And think about the really fabulously gorgeous artifacts that are iconic in the field of archaeology. And just think about people who created those things and the skills they must have had and the artistic vision that they must have had to create things in the midst of what were sort of very crazy and dangerous and disconcerting politics of the time. I think it's really sort of a lesson in how resilient we can and must be as we go through the current things that are going on in the world.
Absolutely. I would think you learn quite a bit from looking at the artifacts about ourselves today, which is one of the benefits of looking in the past always. You've been to Panama now. Tell us a little bit about that specifically, relating to the golden chiefs of Panama.
First of all, it's sort of a real funny tale about how journalism works. Julia Mayo, the Panamanian Spanish archaeologist who was working on this site, which is about an hour and a half drive west of Panama City, she sort of had an idea, and it plays into a larger theme, and it's why her site became paradigm breaking. For decades and generations, literally nobody looked in Central America for anything archaeological because there was a very famous anthropologist who worked at the Smithsonian, I believe back in the 1950s. And she said, look, something along the lines of, we know the Maya built these wonderful stone pyramids in southern Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras. And we know that the Inca built fabulous stone walls and roads in Peru, in South America. But there's nothing in Central America. Why would there be? It's only rainforest, so didn't even bother to look. And so for decades and generations, people did not look. Along come archaeologists like Julia Mayo, and they say, wait a minute. Just because people had a material culture that was biodegradable doesn't mean that their culture wasn't interesting and sophisticated. And she thought, having read all sorts of chronicles that were written by the Spanish conquistadors in the 1600s, even 1500s, she thought that there should be graves that perhaps might have some gold artifacts and would have artifacts signaling a sophisticated hierarchical culture. Okay, great. Julia was a National Geographic grantee, and photographer David Coventry and I were sent down to Panama when Julia started to dig. Well, we sat on the rim of this growing pit in the ground, and Julia was finding pottery and bones and pottery. And David and I are looking at each other saying, well, from a theoretical archaeological point of view, this is sort of interesting, but it's not really photogenic. And for the National Geographic magazine, of course, we needed great photographs. And we were sitting there for 2 weeks just watching this and feeling, sweaty and dusty and just wondering what we were going to do. So we got to the end of the field season. So this is one of the things that makes archaeologists laugh all the time, because it is inevitably on the very last day of the field season, something interesting turns up. Last day of the field season, it was Good Friday. Julia was going to shut down the dig because what happens is the rainy season begins, and then the nearby river floods, and it floods the site, and there's no way she could continue to dig. We're getting towards the afternoon, and it's like 4:30 in the afternoon, and boom, gold starts coming up.
Ooh.
Yeah.
What do you do now?
Well, yeah. So we ran out, Julia ran out, and she bought gas lanterns that we could put on the edge, on the rim of this pit. We were down 16 feet, this huge pit. And we took all the vehicles we had and we lined them up also around the edge of the pit and put on the headlights. The archaeologists started to excavate because, of course, you can't leave gold like that. You have to get it up.
Right.
And so, over the course of maybe the next couple of days, I mean, we dug up it was tubular beads that were wound around somebody's lower leg in a sort of a zigzag decorated form, fat, hollow beads as big as olives that made a belt going around this person's waist. If I remember correctly, there was a gold pectoral. And so we got up all of that stuff. And there are photographs of the artist, sketching all of this stuff by a gas lamp. It was after dark. So we take all of this stuff out of the ground after Julia has documented it, where to store this overnight. So she told me later she had it underneath her bed in the dig house.
Oh, my goodness.
And she hardly slept the whole night. Well, we were out in a small town in the provinces, and there was no way that we could take it to Panama City that late at night. Of course, the next morning we got up and sped it into Panama City so that it could be put into a safe. But that was very exciting because the moment when Julia was proved right. And as the seasons rolled forward, Julia found quite a number of graves of these, what she's calling the golden chiefs of Panama. And they were all buried chock-a-block full of gold. Well, so they had a material culture. It was biodegradable, didn't leave anything that, anybody would look at these days. But Julia used a lot of new technology, including geomagnetic surveys that uncovered anomalies in the ground, indicating to her that she was right, that it was an enormous circular cemetery at a site called El Caño. Yeah.
Yeah.
It becomes sort of paradigm breaking. Yeah. And she is one of the emerging younger archaeologists who are starting to find things in the Amazon, which everybody had written off, and in Central America, which many people had written off. And there are wonderful archaeological things to be found there that tell us a lot about people who live there in very sophisticated communities.
Yeah, there's a lot to learn.
Very exciting things that's happened recently in archaeology.
I would think that with the new technology, there will be so many discoveries in the next years that we can't imagine. And that's what's so exciting. You just don't know what's under your feet. I wrote a list of some of the places just in my travels that I remember where I've seen archaeologists still working, and many of these sites are only partially discovered. So here's a list off the top of my head. Of course, Machu Picchu, the great city that everyone knows. We were mentioning the stone walls. People were working there when I was there 20 years ago, still doing research. It's only partly discovered. So there's much more to see eventually. Tikal in the jungle of Guatemala. This is where jaguars roam around at night. It's very exceptional. And I think many people still haven't discovered it. It's one of the great places to visit. I happen to have seen that. Tulum in the Yucatan, where many people visit as part of their beach escape. It's right on the beach. It's a wonderful introduction to lost cultures. Not only Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy, where Mount Vesuvius covered those towns in ash, but close to the airport outside of Rome, there's Ostia Antica, which is a fabulous site, one of the great sites. It's 5 miles from the airport. I was just there recently, and you can spend your time walking through the pass there. And not many people go. If you ask them about it, they won't know it's there, but it's right by the airport. There's Angkor Wat in Cambodia, where I visited, which was huge. And again, people were still doing research at the moment I was there, again, about 15 years ago. And places you can see from the road, such as Stonehenge in England. All these places have such mystery, like you mentioned. How do these people do these things? In the Greek islands, many people go to Mykonos. There's a little island called Delos, which has wonderful archaeological sites right by there. Take a little break from the partying and go over there. And I've just stumbled across things. I've walked across active sites in the streets. I can remember in Rouen, France, not far from where Joan of Arc was burned at the stake, a person was just digging in the road, and I was looking in there, and there were bones and all kinds of things, and it was fascinating. I was just walking along to go to lunch. City in Miami, of course, I live here. I don't expect to see too many ancient things, just people, some ancient people, perhaps, that walk around the streets. But at my dentist's office, just outside where they're building a new condo, is a fantastic site of the Tequesta Indians from 2,500 years ago. They've been working on it now for 2 years. It's been holding up construction. Whatever you think of Miami, you don't think of that, right? I remember way, way back when I was very young, I went to Cyprus, and I was just walking along a beach and stumbled across some artifacts in the grass by the beach. And again, this was a informal. You if you travel, you're going to find these wonderful things. I took a little time to name a few places you want to help or visit. It depends, but you can check them out. One program is Maximo Nivel's Anthropology University program in Latin America, which includes excursions to archaeological sites. If a university course isn't for you, you could check out Go Echo, which offers an archaeological volunteer project near Rome, and Volunteering Solutions, which offers archaeology programs in Greece. And if you're a teenage volunteer or part of a group, then you can check out Project Abroad's archaeology volunteer program in Peru.
If people are interested in volunteering on an archaeological site, they can go to the Archaeological Institute of America. It's AIA. There is a section on the website that lists places where you can volunteer.
Now, Anne, your book features lost cities in the title, and they offer especially wonderful stories and myths. Let's talk about a few of them. The Legend of Troy and how an amateur archaeologist uncovered a lost city. Tell us a little bit about that.
Let's talk about Troy. Such a wonderful, crazy story, but it's also sort of a cautionary tale. Heinrich Schliemann was a businessman. He lived in the 1800s, and he had read Homer and got very inspired and thought he could kind of take the clues in Homer and figure out where Troy was in Turkey. And so off he went, and I wouldn't say he excavated, I would say he dug at the site that is now known as Hisarlik. The good news is that he got everybody excited and very inspired. The bad news is that this was before archaeology was really a science. And so he dug straight down until he found something nice. And it meant that he really didn't record a lot of the details in the layers as he was digging down. Archaeology is such a science now. You would not believe the minutiae that archaeological digs are able to extract from the site. And it is a multidisciplinary effort. You bring out with you a geologist, a soil chemist, a mosaic expert, a person who counts pollen grains, a physical anthropologist who can look at the bones. I mean, the list goes on, and all of your digital specialists, because now everything is being recorded digitally. It was just wonderful. You have a find, you publish it digitally, and then scholars around the world can have a look and weigh in. None of that was going on in Schliemann's time. He just dug a big hole. And there is a very famous photograph of his wife wearing fabulous necklaces and earrings that he found at Troy. Of course, nobody would do that these days, but he just sort of gathered up this stuff, took it to the dig house, and dressed his wife up in it and took a photograph. It's a little crazy. He is part of the legend of archaeology, and he was one of the early people who was interested in the past and interested in digging up things. An example of what not to do than what to do. We can't discount his enthusiasm.
It's enthusiastic. I was lucky enough to see the after effects, but is the discovery of the glorious terracotta warriors escorting China's first emperor into the afterlife, which were discovered near Xi'an in China. And those were discovered, the legend goes, by farmers in their fields. And of course, I visited the beautiful warriors and horses. Was this true? They just came upon it? How did that happen?
This is a true fact. It was in the 1970s, and farmers were digging a drainage ditch. They came across these statues and, basically said, well, that's very frightening. You dig up something and it looks like something very eerie.
Lots of them.
And you have to remember, when these things first came to light, they were brightly painted. Excavations have continued through the years. So they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these statues. They're all standing in rows. That section of the site is not completely excavated. When the Chinese first started to dig that site, the statues came up and they were covered in paint, and there wasn't the technology to save the paint.
Oh.
And working with, I believe, some German technicians, the Chinese and the Germans figured out how to save the paint.
Wow.
But they are mindful of the fact that as technology is rolling forward, there may be things about additional statues that are underground that will be able to be saved in the future with technologies that we can't even imagine these days. So they're not in a big hurry to finish. That excavation site is a tiny part of an enormous funerary complex that was put together by the first emperor and his people. A large army meant to defend the body of the first emperor in the afterlife from an attack, which most likely would have come from the east. But there are all sorts of other things around the grave of the first emperor. There's a place they think where concubines were. There's a place where there were laborers buried. And there is the burial of the emperor himself. There are people who have sort of noodled around that place, and they are convinced that they know where the emperor was buried. And they believe that there is a void where that burial should be. But again, the Chinese government is in no hurry to try to excavate that, because they don't want to be excavating it and come across things that they can't save. And sort of waiting until technology evolves so that they can make sure that they save absolutely every scrap of information. That's very exciting.
Not just the past, it's also the present and the future.
Sure.
Well, the name of the podcast is Places I Remember. You've shared some wonderful stories. Can you share one more, a personal memory of your research in archaeology?
Well, I think the absolutely coolest thing that I got to do in the field of archaeology was be in the Valley of the Kings the night that King Tut was CAT scanned.
Whoa.
At this point, I had done a couple of stories about ancient Egypt because National Geographic magazine had realized that I knew about Middle Eastern archaeology and I knew a little bit about ancient Egypt. And so I was assigned the story about the CAT scanning of King Tut. And so I was there in the Valley of the Kings with Dr. Zahi Hawass and the National Geographic television crew and photographer Ken Garrett. In those days at National Geographic, we had a lot of time to research things before we wrote about anything. And so I became sort of an amateur sleuth and amateur expert on the life and times of King Tut. And so it was a real thrill for me to be there in KV62, King Tut's tomb, while his coffin was being opened, his mummy was taken out. It was a very chaotic evening. And at one point, a lot of us who were not actually taking photographs were asked to leave the tomb. So I stopped up the ramp and I was very cross. And I thought, well, I should be in there to see, what's going on. But anyway, I stationed myself at the top of the stairs, right around the corner. And I thought, well, I'll just wait here until the next thing happened. The next thing I knew, King Tut was being carried right in front of me. I had managed by dumb blind luck to station myself right at the place where he passed. So they
Well, what did he look like?
well, poor Tut, he's not in very good shape. He was a tiny person, he was 5 foot something. What did they say? He was gracile. He was very thin. He, like many ancient people along the Nile, had malaria.
Well, he was very young when he died, correct?
About 19 years old.
Yeah. What were they looking for specifically?
So there were a number of theories being floated that went back to, I believe, 1923. There was a theory, for instance, that came out of an X-ray that was done in 1968. And the X-ray revealed a fragment of bone inside King Tut's skull. So from there, people began imagining, well, murder, intrigue, somebody bonking him over the head. Well, no. As it turns out, when you mummified somebody in the New Kingdom, the ancient Egyptians believed that the center of one's conscience was one's heart. And so one's heart was usually left in the body. The brain was just a bunch of gooey, nasty stuff. And in terms of mummification, it had to be gotten rid of. They took a metal hook and they stuck it up the nose of the deceased and broke through, I think it's called the hyoid bone. Boom. And so you push this hook into somebody's nose, you break through that bone, you stir up the brain until it's, a gooey mess, and then you tip the mummy and the brain comes oozing out. Well, that's what they did for King Tut. He was not bonked over the head. Certainly damage that was done by Howard Carter. Howard Carter, in all fairness, had to get that body out of the
in the 1920s, right?
In the 1920s, he had to get that body out of the solid gold coffin, the solid gold mask off the head. You could just imagine if they had left that and the thieves had come in, we wouldn't have gotten anything.
And what year was this that you were?
This was January 5th, 2005.
Wow.
The tomb was not well guarded during World War II. The theory is that some people got in and started to pick at the mummy to get at beads. There were mummy experts who looked at these CAT scans and thought that one of King Tut's knees looked like it had been broken. Not only broken, but then healed a little bit after the bone break. King Tut was doing something. Riding in battle, riding his chariot too fast, upended by a hippo, something, and broke his leg. Perhaps infection set in. And of course, back in those days, there was no penicillin, and you got an infection like that and you died. And that's the current thing. It was a thrill to be there that night, be so close to King Tut's mummy. It was always interesting, of course, to work with Dr. Hawass. Because I had so much time to study up before I wrote that story, I became sort of an amateur expert in all of the stuff in King Tut's tomb. And some of the things in that tomb are so beautiful, I can't even begin to express to you what skill it took to create them. They are just extraordinary. And it's not only the big honking gold stuff that we all know. It's beautiful cosmetic cases, for instance, that were made in the shape of geese and, a swimming girl and a grasshopper. Just exquisite, exquisite things from that tomb and from that time period. That was the gateway for me. I got fascinated with all that stuff. As Ken Garrett, the photographer, and I say, the more you know in ancient Egypt, the more you want to know. Archaeology it's a great jigsaw puzzle. But in ancient Egypt, there's so many pieces to the puzzle. And we know people's names. We know the names of kings. We know their queens. We know their viziers. We know their children. And suddenly you start to put together this great jigsaw puzzle through time, through space. and it becomes fascinating.
Hmm.
So the dig season runs from October to March. Otherwise, Egypt is pretty hot. Wait for October to roll around. We're always waiting to see what is coming out of the ground so that we can then take that piece and put it in that jigsaw puzzle that we have going in our mind.
Fascinating.
That's what I do every fall. And the cat scanning of King Tut was the beginning of all of that.
Great story. I would remind listeners that at the New Cairo Museum, which is what I hear, it's fabulous. Many of these artifacts can be seen. It's a good reason to travel there if you're interested in that.
The Grand Egyptian Museum, which has been a decade in the making, there is a specially created gallery for the artifacts from King Tut's tomb. For the first time in more than a century, we'll bring all of those artifacts together. So,
reason to go. Thank you, Anne Williams, author of Lost Cities, Ancient Tombs, 100 Discoveries That Changed the World. By the way, Anne has just put out another book from National Geographic, Treasures of Egypt, A Legacy in Photographs from the Pyramids to Cleopatra. And we'd love to have you on again to talk about that one. So thank you very much. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you for having me. And I'd be delighted to come back to talk about Egypt.
Thanks for listening to our award-winning podcast. We've recorded over 100 episodes of Places I Remember, so follow us on any podcast app. And new monthly episodes are also on YouTube with gorgeous video. My book, Places I Remember, is available in print and Kindle, and I read the audio version. Follow my travel writing at Forbes.com. Contact me at the links in the show notes or on my website, placesirememberlealane.com, and keep making your own travel memories.